Welcome to Substance Stories. I'm your host, Richard Bradlow, and I'm joined tonight by Dr. Fergal Armstrong, my colleague at the Victoria Clinic. Fergal, how are you? And thank you for joining me.
I'm very well, and it's always a pleasure.
So today I want to talk about what to do when you believe your loved one has an addiction, or you believe you may have an addiction, and what to look out for when you believe, how to notice you have an addiction. So Fergal, how do you notice that a loved one or you might have an addiction? What would be your top warning signs?
Yeah, that's a big question. Let's break it down. Let's talk about firstly, how do you notice it in someone else? I think the key thing about realizing that your loved one has a problem with substances is when it becomes impairing.
Yeah.
However, which way you choose to you choose to define impairment. The criteria, the diagnostic criteria from the DSM-5 will talk about loss of inability to meet role obligations and loss of personal relationships. And I think those two key factors are absolutely crucial to make the diagnosis. But that's really the pointy end. There is a slippery slope where there's a disquiet. How do you actually address that? And it's really got to be on impairment. And a spouse or a loved one will have the tail tingle for a long time before anything is broached, before the subject is broached. But it's always got to do with impairment. They didn't turn up for a meeting. They didn't turn up for a birthday party, or they were socially inappropriate at a dinner party.
Well, obviously, let's leave us that are often socially appropriate sober. It's not, but I 100% agree.
Yes, well,
What I really, and often, to really zone in on things, what does that impairment look like? To me, it often looks like withdrawal and social withdrawal, and not just sort of just wanting to spend more time alone in their room, which I think you do see quite a bit in young people, but also if it's a spouse or a partner, avoiding social activities that usually you would do previously, even if that's just having a family meal. I think could be that change in behavior can be a real warning sign of that loss of that.
Yeah, that's a very good point. The social withdrawal and the circle of experience diminishes, and it becomes more and more more and more focused on the substance, and the substance becomes more salient. But withdrawal, I like that. That's a really good marker, I think, of something amiss. So the teenager who doesn't go out of his room unless it's midnight, or the teenager that has school refusal, or doesn't go to university, and something's going wrong.
Yeah, because I think it's
you also.
Sorry.
I was going to say, you raised a very valid point that it's not just due to substances. These changes in behaviors can be explained by other diagnoses, but it's certainly important to consider substance disorder as part of that picture.
Yeah, and I think it's tricky because I was basically about to say exactly that, because these things can present in a myriad of different ways, and what I think is the most important to notice in yourself, if you're worried about yourself, or in others, is that, as you say, your tail is tingling, you have concern. And I think that leads really well into what you do about it, which is express that concern in a loving way. And what makes that really, or if it's yourself, be able to have an honest and open conversation with a loved one or with a GP about your concerns. And I think that's really tricky, because in order for that to be possible, there needs to be a baseline, a sort of a base of relationship there, a baseline level of mutual respect and love. And often people lack that in their lives. They lack someone who they truly can come to and talk about something that they're concerned about in a non-judgmental manner, where that person is concerned about them but not going to chide them in that parental role. So what I always say when someone says, how can we prevent addiction in a loved one, or how can we help a loved one with addiction? I say, well, before they have an addiction, work on having a happy and healthy relationship with them. But in that moment, what you want to avoid is taking on that chiding parental role, because no one responds to that. No one responds to being yelled at or being told they have to do something. That change can only come from within. So when you are concerned about someone, don't jump to, you must be using drugs. Express exactly what you're feeling. And that is, I'm worried. I don't know what's going on, but I'm scared and I love you. Because that's what you're saying. Is that a reasonable comment, Phil? Do you have anything to add to that?
Totally. That's a very, very reasonable. I think it's you've highlighted for me one of the key issues about helping someone with an addiction is that you've got to maintain the love. You've got to maintain the therapeutic relationship. Johann Hari, who did a really famous podcast on addiction, said something which I think is true. He said the opposite of addiction is not abstinence; it's social connection. And he, in that TED talk, he actually did discuss the difficulty that most people have in maintaining the love, the relationship for someone who's in active addiction, because it's very difficult. And it boils down to this a philosophy of love the sinner but hate the sin. So yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly. But the other point I wanted to go back to was how, if you've got it, we've talked about how does addiction present in a loved one, but how do you know yourself that you've got an addiction?
It's really hard. I think it goes down to what you were talking about before, about noticing the effect it's having on your life, and I guess noticing perhaps how your priorities are changing. So there's a wonderful book that I recommend to every clinician called Addiction as an Attachment Disorder that really talks about how what addiction is we're going to say that opposite of connection. It's a growing and all-encompassing connection to a behavior that destroys all other connections you have in your life. And I think that's really relevant to how do you notice in yourselves? Is this thing taking an out? Are you deciding, well, I don't need to have dinner with the family. I don't need to have dinner with my wife. I don't need to have dinner with my parents. I don't need to catch up with friends because I'd rather stay in and get drunk or smoke weed or go score. I think that is really what you have to look out for.
I would say two more things. Firstly, I would say that when drug use becomes or no longer is impulsive but becomes compulsive, then that's a significant milestone in the route towards addiction. And so we need to explain what that means. Impulsive means it's fun, and compulsive means that you have to take it just to feel normal. And so when I hear that phrase in patients, I take that, I don't get the buzz anymore. I just take it because I need to, just to get through the day, just to feel normal. That to me is a significant milestone. And I think it's important to ask yourself that. Why are you taking the drug? Is it just occasional, once a month use and you really are in control? Or do you need to take it just to feel normal? The second point I would say is actually, I think the wisdom in the 12-step program will come to our rescue here in terms of answering the question, how do you know if a loved one, or for that matter yourself, has got an addiction? The first step of the 12-step program states, we acknowledge to ourselves and others that we are powerless over the substance and that our lives have become unmanageable. And that to me emphasizes the compulsive use of substances and the impairment associated with substances. And it does it so much more eloquently, I think, than the DSM-5 or me, or for that matter, me. What do you think about that?
I agree completely, Fergal. I really think, especially what you're saying, that from when it becomes an impulse control disorder to a compulsive disorder, or how I often phrase it is when you are doing something to have a good time, and when it changes to doing something to not have a bad time. I think is really, exactly. But that can be very, very difficult to notice in yourself, which is why it is very helpful to have a loved one. can have this sort of conversation with you, and why it's important to try to not retreat into defensiveness when a loved one expresses concern. So what do you do,
Where does
Fergal? No, I think so.
where does the desire to retreat come from, though?
I think that is a natural human instinct. When we're attacked, we retreat into defensiveness.
Yeah,
I think that is just who we are as people.
I think it's also denial. I think there's a lot of self denial in terms of substance use, and to actually acknowledge you've got a problem
Yeah,
takes a lot of people a lot of time. Getting to rock bottom doesn't happen overnight, does it?
yeah, but I don't think you need to get to rock bottom to make change. I think that I'm going to challenge that slightly. I think that a lot can be changed in the approach of the person that is expressing concern. And I think if someone truly comes to you expressing concern out of a place of love, and that's what you feel, I don't think people will
Mm.
retreat. And they might deny, they might deny and say no, it's fine. But I don't think they'll necessarily retreat into defensiveness. I think that comes out of being attacked, and I think that if the approach is done right, then you doesn't need to be a confrontation. It can be an expression of love and taken as that. Doesn't mean that the person will agree and say they do have a substance use disorder. They might say, no, it's fine, but I'm thankful for your concern. But I don't
Hmm.
think it necessarily needs to result in an argument. But what should people do, Fergus? So we've talked about admitting that there's a problem. What else would you do? You're sitting there, you're thinking, I have a substance use disorder. What is your first step?
I think you need to seek professional help, and I think that you need to maintain your social relationships, and that's very difficult to do when you are in the midst of a substance use disorder. And so it's really, I mean, when people come to see me, they usually don't come on their own. They usually come with their spouse or their loved one, and the loved one does the talking for them and say,
Mm,
my Johnny's got a alcohol disorder. Um, that's my experience. But you do need to, the key message is that substance use disorders are curable. If I had to have a chronic disease, be it cancer or be it heart disease, or diabetes, or be it an alcohol use disorder, not that I would wish any disease upon myself or anyone else for that matter, but I'd rather have a substance use disorder because I know that heart disease, cancer, and diabetes have a worse prognosis than alcohol use disorder. You can
yeah,
cure yourself of substance use disorders.
yeah. But I think what people get stuck in is where to go first. How do you seek professional help? So I think if you're calling from Australia, there are local drug and alcohol services that you can access through um, Direct Line if you're in Victoria, or in New South Wales, I believe it's also called Direct Line. And these are free services that you can access. They have a triage number that's 24/7.
Mm.
You can go speak to your GP, who will be able to refer you to specialists, or maybe as a specialist in drug and alcohol themselves. And you can go to an AA or an NA group, which is everywhere. And AA and NA are the most evidence-based interventions in terms of bang for buck for substance use disorders. So there is actually a lot of help out there. It can feel bewildering to try and access,
Mm.
but it is really, really quite easy to access if you know where to look. And I think that's the difficult part often is people don't know where to look.
Yeah, so you can go online and Google AA, NA, or 12-step programs, and you will get a list of online programs and also a list of locally face-to-face programs. The key thing is making that first step because it's frightening.
Mm,
It's very, very
terrifying.
frightening to actually walk in that door for the first time. And I've helped a lot of people who initially said to me, I didn't like it because I didn't identify with everyone else in that group.
Yeah.
Everyone, and the way I see it is that everyone who attends a group is different. And if you look for differences, you'll find those differences. But if you look for the shared commonality that they have all, as per the first step, acknowledged to themselves and others that they are unable to control their substance use and that their lives have become unmanageable, that common point of shared experience is the starting point for the shared recovery. So if you focus on differences, you will find differences. If you focus on recovery, you will have a shared recovery. And a lot of people get very judgy when they first go through it, and they say things like, oh, look, all I heard in AA was stories about, lying in the gutter with a brown bag, and I've still got a job, a wife, and a car.
Mm.
So that group's not for me, or AA is not for me. That's a perfect example of A, judgment, and B, not looking at the shared recovery. So on the one hand, there's a barrier from our own internal attitudes and our own internal judgments. And then there's also a barrier in terms of actually getting over the fear of crossing the threshold, be it an online threshold or a physical threshold. And that's where services need to be aware of the very first response they give to people looking for help. There's got to be a smile in that first response. There's got to be love in that first response.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think I really loved what you said about if you look for differences, you'll find them. And I think with your, with the importance of services making a great first impression and being as welcoming as possible, I think that's what's so great about modern services is it's really often quite peer-led, especially at the front end. So there's, modern drug and alcohol services often have a lot of peer workers that have been through it, have can say what helped them and can help guide you through it. But I think we're probably running out of time, so I want to thank everyone for listening. If you have any ideas for a future episode, please write in. Let us know your thoughts. Until then, I want to thank Dr. Fergal Armstrong very much for joining us today. I've been Richard Bradlow, and this has been Substance Stories.